For 3 mornings, the white cloth was gone. No family member noticed. No neighbor came looking. But a U.S. Marine and his canine did. For nearly 2 years, they had watched the same elderly woman hang that cloth on her porch at exactly the same time every morning. Then one morning, both she and the cloth suddenly disappeared. What the Marine didn't know was that she had been hanging it there for 5 years, and when he finally discovered why, he realized that this ordinary white cloth had been carrying a message no one knew they were supposed to see. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late November had turned the countryside outside Newport, North Carolina, cold and pale, with thin fog drifting between longleaf pines and frost gathering along empty county roads before sunrise. Staff Sergeant Grant Calloway preferred running before the rest of the world woke. At 40, the U.S. Marine stood just over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean, with short, dark brown hair beginning to gray at the temples, close-trimmed stubble along a square jaw, and a faint scar near his left cheekbone. His gray-green eyes carried the steady alertness of a man trained to notice what changed around him. Years in the Marine Corps had given Grant discipline, but they had also left him uncomfortable with too much stillness. Running 6 miles every morning gave his thoughts somewhere to go. He never listened to music. He preferred the rhythm of his breathing, his shoes striking pavement, and the familiar footfalls beside him. Flint ran at his left on a training lead. The 7-year-old German Shepherd was black and tan, athletic and powerfully built, with upright ears, intelligent amber-brown eyes, and a small notch along the edge of his right ear. A trained canine, Flint knew Grant's pace almost as well as Grant did, and was particularly sensitive to changes in familiar surroundings. Grant trusted the dog's instincts without turning them into something mystical. Flint noticed things. Grant decided what they meant. For almost 2 years, their route had followed the same county road through pine country and past an aging white farmhouse standing alone behind a low wooden fence. The property belonged to Norah Winslow, a 77-year-old widow with a slender frame, weathered fair skin, blue-gray eyes, and silver-white hair, usually gathered into a loose bun. Her narrow hands showed swollen knuckles from decades of work, and she normally wore a faded, dark blue house dress beneath a brown knitted cardigan with practical leather shoes. Age had slowed her movements, but Grant had never seen helplessness in them. Norah carried herself with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had spent a lifetime handling whatever needed to be handled. Almost every morning at approximately 6:20, the farmhouse door opened. Norah stepped onto the porch, carrying a clean white kitchen cloth. She shook it once, walked to the same section of railing, and draped it carefully across the wood. She always smoothed one corner with her palm before letting go. By afternoon, the cloth would be gone again. Grant had never asked why. He had his morning run. Norah had her white cloth. People were allowed rituals they didn't explain. At first, their relationship consisted of nothing more than a raised hand and a nod. Eventually, Grant added words. "Morning, ma'am." "Morning, Marine." That had surprised him. He couldn't remember ever telling Norah what he did. For several mornings, he considered asking how she knew, but eventually decided he preferred the small mystery. Flint was less reserved about his interest in her. Whenever the farmhouse appeared beyond the trees, his ears shifted forward. He never pulled toward the property or broke stride, but his eyes searched the porch until he found Norah. She noticed. One particularly cold morning, Norah stood beside the railing with her cardigan buttoned high against her throat, while the white cloth moved gently in the wind. "Morning, handsome," she called. Grant glanced toward her. "Well, that's generous this early." Norah stared at him for a beat, then raised one crooked finger and pointed toward Flint. "I meant him." Grant's laugh came unexpectedly enough to disturb his breathing. Behind him, Norah laughed too. The sound was soft and brief, but Grant carried it farther down the road than he expected. After that morning, something subtle changed. They still weren't friends in the ordinary sense. Grant never walked onto her property, and Norah never invited him inside. Yet he began looking toward the porch before consciously meaning to. If the porch light was glowing through the morning fog, some small part of him registered that things were as they should be. Norah occasionally remained beside the railing until Flint looked toward her, and the shepherd began anticipating her voice before they reached the farmhouse. Grant sometimes wondered about the second chair beside Norah's little porch table. He wondered whether she had children or grandchildren, whether anyone visited on Sundays, whether someone had once occupied that chair every morning. On frosty days, he noticed that only one set of footprints usually crossed the porch. He never asked. Part of that restraint came from respect. Norah possessed the unmistakable dignity of someone who had worked hard to preserve her independence. Grant understood that kindness offered carelessly could feel like pity. But another part came from him. A wave from the road was safe. A few words exchanged in passing required nothing from either of them. Grant had spent enough years learning how quickly people could become important and how abruptly circumstances could take them away. He had never consciously decided to keep others at a distance. Somewhere along the way, distance had simply become easier. Flint, fortunately, understood none of that. The dog simply liked Norah. Some mornings she leaned slightly toward him as they passed. "You keep him working too hard," she once told Grant. "He'd run twice this far if I let him." Norah looked at Flint. "Don't listen to him. You deserve breakfast." Grant shook his head. "Now you're undermining discipline." Norah smiled, and Grant found himself wondering how often anyone else made her smile after he and Flint disappeared around the bend. He didn't like the answer his imagination offered. Still, he kept running. It was easier to respect a boundary than question whether it existed because both people were afraid to cross it. What Grant didn't know was that Norah had carried that white cloth onto the porch every morning for 5 years, 3 years before his running route ever brought him past the farmhouse. He didn't know her nearest relative lived hours away. He didn't know that there were days when no one came through the front gate, or that some evenings passed without another human voice inside the old house. Most importantly, he didn't know the cloth wasn't really there to dry. That particular morning, however, everything looked exactly as it should. The porch light glowed weakly through the fog, the front door opened, Norah appeared with the folded white cloth beneath one arm. Grant felt Flint's attention shift toward her before his own. "Morning, ma'am." "Morning, Marine." Norah looked toward Flint. "And good morning to the handsome one." Grant shook his head. "You're going to give him an ego." "He earned one." Grant smiled and continued running. Behind them, Norah unfolded the cloth and placed it over the railing. Her fingers lingered against the white fabric for a moment. Then she stood quietly watching the Marine and his German shepherd disappear into the thinning fog. Grant never looked back. Why would he? Tomorrow morning, the farmhouse would still be there. Norah would step through the same door. The white cloth would appear on the same railing. Flint would turn his head. Grant would raise his hand. After nearly 2 years, the sequence felt almost permanent. That was what repetition did. It turned something unusual into something ordinary, and then made the ordinary almost invisible. Grant had seen Norah's white cloth so many mornings that he had stopped wondering why it was there. He would begin wondering again when it wasn't. Sunday night brought a harder cold to the countryside outside Newport, pushing wind through the pines and leaving Norah Winslow's farmhouse surrounded by darkness, except for the yellow porch light above her door. A man arrived shortly after 8. Norah opened the door only halfway. The visitor appeared to be in his late 40s, tall and thick through the shoulders, with close-cropped graying hair, a broad face marked by deep lines around the mouth, and dark eyes that remained disturbingly calm. A charcoal jacket covered most of his heavy frame. Nothing about him would have frightened a stranger at first glance. Norah was not a stranger. Recognition changed her face immediately. "You remember me," he said. Her fingers tightened around the door. "I remember enough." Every instinct told Norah to close it. But 12 years had passed since she had last seen that face, and for several dangerous seconds, surprise held her where fear should have moved her. The conversation remained quiet at first. The man said something that made Norah's expression harden. "No." He stepped forward. Norah retreated into the house rather than let him crowd her against the doorway. A chair scraped violently across the kitchen floor. Her reading glasses fell. Then the farmhouse went quiet. Monday morning arrived beneath a low, gray sky. Grant Calloway and Flint followed their usual route, their breath turning white in the cold. As the farmhouse came into view, Grant looked toward the porch without consciously deciding to. It was empty. So was the railing. For several seconds, he expected the door to open and Norah to emerge carrying the white cloth. It remained closed. Grant kept running. One missed morning meant nothing. Norah was 77. She could have slept late, felt unwell, or simply decided the cold wasn't worth stepping outside for. Still, Grant glanced back before the farmhouse disappeared behind the trees. The empty railing stayed in his mind longer than it should have. By Tuesday, the absence felt different. Flint noticed first. As they approached the property, the German shepherd shortened his stride and turned his head toward the porch. No Norah, no white cloth. Flint glanced up at Grant. "Keep moving." The dog obeyed, but Grant found himself slowing too. He almost stopped. Almost. Then reason intervened. He didn't know Norah's schedule beyond the few minutes their mornings overlapped. Maybe family had collected her. Maybe she had an appointment. Maybe she was visiting someone. 2 years of exchanging greetings did not give Grant ownership over the rest of her life. Yet, halfway through the run, he realized he was irritated. Not with Norah, with himself. Part of him wanted to turn around. Another part warned that he was constructing danger from nothing more than an empty porch. Grant had spent years learning the difference between observation and assumption. A change mattered, but it did not automatically mean a threat. So he finished his run. That evening, however, the farmhouse crossed his mind again. Wednesday morning came colder still. This time, Flint stopped. There was no barking or dramatic pull against the lead. The shepherd simply slowed near Norah's driveway and planted his paws against the roadside. Grant took another step before the lead tightened. "Flint." The dog's ears stood forward. His gaze remained fixed on the farmhouse before his nose lifted briefly into the cold air. Grant followed his attention. The porch light was off. The railing was empty. The curtains looked exactly as they had Monday. Something settled heavily inside Grant. 3 mornings. Once could be chance. Twice could still be explained. 3 times meant the routine had changed. And Norah had not seemed like a woman who changed routines casually. "All right." Grant walked up the driveway with Flint beside him. A newspaper lay near the edge of the path, darkened by moisture. Another had landed partly beneath it. Grant's unease sharpened. He climbed the porch steps and knocked. "Norah?" Nothing. He waited, then knocked harder. "Ma'am, it's Grant." Silence pressed against the other side of the door. For the first time, Grant felt something colder than the morning air move through him. He pictured Norah on the kitchen floor, injured and unable to reach a phone. The possibility was ordinary enough to be frightening. His hand moved toward the doorknob, then stopped. Concern wasn't permission. There was no cry for help, no smoke, no visible emergency that justified forcing entry. Grant stepped back and called the Carteret County Sheriff's Office. He explained that Norah was 77, lived alone, and had failed to appear for a morning routine he had observed almost daily for nearly 2 years. Saying it aloud made him realize how little he actually knew about her. A deputy arrived soon afterward. Deputy Aaron Pike was 36, medium height and solidly built, with sandy brown hair cut short, a clean-shaven face, and pale blue eyes that moved carefully across the property. His manner was calm and deliberate, rather than dismissive, suggesting a man who preferred evidence before conclusions. "You family?" "No." "Neighbor?" "Not exactly." Pike waited. "I run past every morning. She comes outside around the same time." "For 3 days she hasn't?" Grant nodded. "And there's usually a white cloth on that railing." Pike looked toward it. "No cloth either?" "No." For a moment, Grant heard how strange the evidence sounded, but Pike didn't laugh. He asked several more questions, then walked around the farmhouse checking doors and windows. Grant remained near the porch with Flint. At the rear of the house, Pike stopped. The kitchen door was slightly open. The deputy's posture changed immediately. "Stay here," Pike announced himself before entering. Grant waited. 30 seconds became a minute, then another. Flint stood motionless beside him, attention fixed toward the house. When Pike finally returned, his expression had lost its earlier neutrality. "She isn't inside." Grant's stomach tightened. Another unit was requested. During the initial check, several small details emerged. Nothing looked dramatically destroyed, yet the kitchen felt interrupted rather than abandoned. A chair stood several feet from the table at an awkward angle. Norah's reading glasses lay on the floor. Her phone remained on the counter. The brown winter coat Grant had seen her wearing on colder mornings still hung beside the door. If Norah had left voluntarily, she had done so without things a 77-year-old woman would reasonably take into late November cold. Grant looked at Flint. The shepherd's nose worked quietly toward the side of the farmhouse, but Grant kept the lead short. Not yet. Whatever this was, it had moved beyond a morning run. Then Grant noticed a wicker basket on a bench beside the rear door. Inside were several clean white kitchen cloths, folded into careful squares. He stared at them. For nearly 2 years, one of those pieces of cloth had appeared on Norah's railing every morning. Grant had seen it so often that it had become invisible to him. Now the empty railing felt louder than anything inside the house. 3 mornings without the cloth. 3 mornings without Norah. And for the first time, Grant wondered whether those 2 absences had always been meant to mean the same thing. By late Wednesday morning, the fog had lifted from the countryside outside Newport, but the cold remained beneath a colorless sky, and the pines behind Norah Winslow's farmhouse stood motionless in the weak November light. A second patrol vehicle arrived within minutes, followed by an investigator from the Carteret County Sheriff's Office. The house was treated as a possible missing persons scene, not yet a kidnapping. There was no obvious forced entry, no blood, and no witness who could say Norah had been taken. Deputy Aaron Pike made that distinction clear without dismissing Grant's concern. People left homes unexpectedly. Elderly residents sometimes became confused, accepted rides without telling neighbors, or experienced medical emergencies away from home. Possibilities had to remain possibilities until evidence narrowed them. Grant understood the reasoning. He still didn't like it. Norah's phone remained on the kitchen counter. Her winter coat hung beside the door. Her reading glasses lay beneath the table. 2 newspapers had accumulated outside. Individually, none proved anything. Together, they formed a picture Grant couldn't reconcile with the woman he had watched for nearly 2 years. "She doesn't break routine," he told Pike. "You know that for certain?" "I know what I've seen." Pike waited. "Almost every morning for 2 years," Grant continued. "Same door, same time, same cloth." It sounded inadequate even to him. Yet Grant had spent much of his adult life learning that patterns mattered precisely because people stopped noticing them. While the deputies worked, Flint remained beside him. The shepherd was controlled but increasingly interested in the rear of the farmhouse. His nose lifted repeatedly toward the kitchen door before shifting toward the yard. Grant noticed. So did Pike. He trained for scent work? Yes. Pike considered the dog, then Grant. Keep him controlled. Don't disturb anything we haven't cleared. Grant nodded. Only after the immediate area had been checked did Pike allow them near the rear yard. Grant loosened the lead slightly. Flint moved forward, nose working close to the ground, then lifted his head and changed direction toward the fence. Grant followed without urging him. The dog stopped beside an old wooden post. Something small had caught against a rusted nail. Grant crouched. A narrow piece of brown knitted fabric fluttered in the breeze. He recognized the color immediately. Norah's cardigan. "Pike," the deputy approached, then stopped Grant before he touched it. "Leave it." Pike photographed the fabric and called the investigator over. Beyond the fence, disturbed leaves and compressed grass continued toward a narrow dirt track disappearing between the pines. Flint pulled forward once. Grant held him. Every part of him wanted to follow. The path was right there. So was the possibility that Norah had gone down it. But wanting an answer did not make charging into the woods intelligent. Grant looked at Flint, then at Pike. "Get your canine team." Pike nodded. Grant stepped back. Waiting became harder once he had somewhere to go. The sheriff's canine unit arrived less than half an hour later. Its handler, Sergeant Melissa Vance, was a compact 42-year-old woman with dark auburn hair pulled tightly beneath her cap, a weathered face, and direct hazel eyes. Her movements were economical, her voice quiet, and she carried the self-contained confidence of someone who had spent years trusting evidence more than excitement. Beside her was Ranger, a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois with a fawn coat, black mask, lean, muscular frame, and intense, dark eyes. Unlike Flint's measured calm, Ranger seemed built from compressed energy, waiting for a command to give it direction. Vance spoke briefly with Grant about Flint's behavior, then took over. Grant didn't interfere. Ranger was given a scent reference from Norah's belongings and worked from the rear of the property toward the fence. Within minutes, the Malinois picked up the same direction Flint had indicated, into the pines. Grant and Flint remained behind while Vance, Pike, and another deputy followed at a controlled distance. Grant hated that part more than he expected. His training had conditioned him to move when something was wrong. Standing still felt almost like choosing not to help. But discipline was not always movement. Sometimes it was knowing when someone else was better equipped to take the next step. Nearly 40 minutes later, Pike returned. "We found where the trail ends." Grant searched his expression. "Norah?" Pike shook his head. "A vehicle." The dirt track opened roughly 3/4 of a mile into the woods onto a wider service road. Ranger's trail had ended beside an area of recently disturbed soil. Tire impressions remained visible in the damp ground. Someone had stopped there. Someone had left. The case changed after that. Deputies began asking residents along nearby roads whether they had seen unfamiliar vehicles Sunday night. Most remembered nothing. Then a man living farther down the county road recalled a gray SUV parked near the tree line after dark. He hadn't considered it suspicious enough to report. A gas station several miles from the service road had exterior cameras facing the highway. By mid-afternoon, investigators had footage. Grant waited near the farmhouse while the investigation moved beyond anything he could contribute. He watched people enter and leave Norah's house, carrying evidence bags and cameras. The white railing remained empty. Pike eventually approached him. "We've got a vehicle matching the witness description on camera Sunday night." Grant straightened. "Plate?" "Readable enough." Grant looked toward the farmhouse. "So she was taken." Pike remained careful. We're closer to saying she didn't leave in any normal way. That was enough. Later, a plate search led investigators to a name. Pike did not immediately share it, and Grant didn't ask him to violate procedure. But the deputy's expression changed after speaking with another investigator beside the patrol car. Something had connected. Pike returned holding a thin printout. The registered connection to that vehicle appears in an old case. How old? 12 years. Grant felt Flint shift beside him. Pike looked down at the page again. Norah's name is in it too. For a moment, Grant said nothing. His eyes moved toward the farmhouse, the worn porch, the second chair beside the small table, the empty railing where a white cloth had appeared every morning. For 2 years, he had known Norah only in fragments. Morning, Marine. Morning, handsome. A crooked finger pointing toward Flint. A woman alone on a porch. Grant had mistaken simplicity for the absence of history. Now, somewhere inside a 12-year-old file was another version of Norah Winslow, one he had never known existed. And whoever had driven that gray SUV Sunday night apparently knew that version of her very well. By Wednesday evening, darkness had settled early over Newport, and the temperature was dropping fast. At Norah Winslow's farmhouse, patrol lights moved silently across the empty porch and the bare wooden railing. The 12-year-old file changed the investigation. Grant wasn't shown everything, nor did he expect to be. But Deputy Aaron Pike eventually gave him enough to understand why Norah's disappearance was no longer being treated as an unexplained absence. 12 years earlier, Norah had witnessed part of a violent crime near a small commercial property outside town. She hadn't gone looking for trouble. She had been an ordinary woman returning home at the wrong hour, close enough to see a vehicle, 2 men, and enough of what followed to contradict the story investigators were initially given. A different man had become the early suspect. Norah could have stayed silent. She hadn't. Her statement helped establish that the suspected man could not have committed the crime and redirected investigators toward the people actually involved. The investigation widened. Other offenses surfaced. One of the men eventually sent to prison was Calvin Reddick. Reddick was 51 now, tall and heavy through the chest, with close-cropped graying hair, a broad face carved by hard years, and dark eyes that rarely revealed emotion. He was the man who had stood at Norah's door Sunday night. Prison had added weight to his frame and deepened the lines around his mouth, but it hadn't changed him enough to prevent Norah from recognizing him. He had recently been released, and an unresolved portion of the old investigation had begun drawing attention again. Investigators believed Reddick had learned that authorities might review evidence connected to the original case. Somewhere during those 12 years, he had become convinced Norah still possessed an old document, something she had retained from the time of her statement that could connect him to an act prosecutors had never fully proved. Whether such a document actually existed was still unclear. What mattered was that Reddick believed it did. Grant listened to Pike without interrupting. "She told the truth," he finally said. Pike nodded. And 12 years later, someone came back because of it. Grant looked toward Norah's porch. For 2 years he had known her through fragments. A white cloth, dry humor, a nod in the morning, the way she looked at Flint. Nothing about those moments suggested courage, because Grant had always imagined courage as something visible under pressure. Now he wondered how many forms of courage looked exactly like ordinary life. The gray SUV gave investigators their next direction. Traffic camera footage and gas station video allowed them to reconstruct portions of its movement Sunday night. Combined with the service road where Ranger had lost Norah's scent, the search narrowed toward a heavily wooded area northwest of town. A property record produced another connection. An old hunting cabin stood deep inside the search area on land once used by a relative of Reddick's. That was enough for law enforcement to move. Grant wasn't part of the entry team. He didn't argue. There had been a time when every instinct in him would have demanded movement, but experience had taught him that discipline wasn't measured by how quickly a man stepped into danger. Sometimes it meant recognizing when his presence would make a situation worse. He and Flint remained at a staging point well away from the cabin, while deputies and the tactical team moved in. Waiting was brutal. Grant stood beside a sheriff's vehicle with Flint close to his leg. The German shepherd seemed to sense the tension around them, watching every movement without making a sound. Minutes stretched. Grant kept thinking about Monday morning, the empty railing. He had seen it and continued running. Then Tuesday, he had done the same. Reason told him he couldn't have known. Norah had a life outside the 10 seconds he saw each morning. Calling authorities after one missed appearance would have been unreasonable. None of that completely quieted the thought. What if 3 days had been too long? A burst of radio traffic broke the silence. Grant couldn't make out every word. Then Pike, standing several yards away, turned toward him. They found her. Grant didn't move. Alive? Pike nodded. Alive. Only then did Grant realize how tightly he had been holding Flint's lead. Norah had been held for nearly 3 days. When paramedics brought her from the woods, a blanket was wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale with exhaustion, one cheek bruised, and there were red marks around her wrists. Yet she was conscious and walking with assistance rather than being carried. Grant had expected relief to feel larger. Instead, it arrived quietly, like something inside his chest finally releasing. Norah's eyes moved across the deputies and emergency personnel until they found him. Then Flint. She stopped. One paramedic said something to her, but Norah barely seemed to hear. Her gaze remained on Grant. The cloth. Her voice was rough. Grant understood the question before she finished it. It wasn't there. Something changed in Norah's face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. You noticed? Grant looked down at Flint. The shepherd was already staring at her. We both did. For several seconds, Norah said nothing. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She simply closed them briefly, as though those 3 words had answered something she had been waiting years to know. Grant still didn't understand. He wanted to ask. This wasn't the moment. Flint took a small step forward, then stopped at the limit of the lead. Grant looked toward the paramedic. Is it okay? After receiving permission, he loosened his grip. Flint approached slowly. There was none of the excited energy he sometimes showed when seeing someone familiar. The shepherd seemed to understand that Norah was hurt. He stopped directly in front of her. Norah lowered one trembling hand. Flint pressed his head gently beneath her palm. Her fingers disappeared into the thick fur behind his ear. "Hello, handsome," she whispered. Grant looked away for a second. Behind them, deputies continued moving around the property. Radios crackled. Vehicles idled. Somewhere beyond the lights stood the cabin where Norah had spent nearly 3 days, believing whatever she believed about that white cloth. Grant looked back at her. He knew now why she had disappeared. He knew who had come for her. He knew what 12 years of buried history had brought back to her door. But the one thing he still didn't understand was the thing Norah had asked about first after being rescued. Not her house, not Reddick, not the investigation, the cloth. And judging by the relief in her eyes when Grant said he had noticed it was gone, that simple piece of white fabric had never been simple at all. A week later, morning sunlight returned to the countryside outside Newport, thin and pale after several days of rain, touching the wet pines in the familiar white farmhouse with a quiet warmth November had rarely offered. Norah Winslow was home. Grant did not visit the first day. He understood that returning home after what she had survived was not the same as returning to normal. She needed rest, medical follow-ups, statements to investigators, and time to walk through rooms that no longer felt quite as innocent as they once had. On the third afternoon, Norah called him herself. "Maureen?" "Yes, ma'am." "You still drink coffee?" Grant smiled. "When available." "Tomorrow, 7. Then she hung up. Grant arrived with Flint at exactly 7 the next morning. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he did not remain on the road. Norah sat on the porch, wrapped in her brown cardigan, one hand curled around a steaming cup. The bruising on her cheek had faded to yellow, and exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. But the quiet steadiness Grant remembered had returned. Flint settled beside her chair after receiving permission, close enough for Norah to rest her fingers against the thick fur along his neck. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things: the cold, the rain, Flint's appetite, as though all three of them needed to remember that ordinary life still existed. Then Norah's eyes moved toward the empty section of railing. "You've been wondering about the cloth." Grant looked at her. "Since you asked about it before anything else." Norah lowered her gaze to her coffee. 5 years earlier, she explained, her husband had been dead for only 4 months. One morning, she had been reaching across the kitchen counter when she lost her balance and fell. Nothing dramatic happened. She didn't break a hip or strike her head, but she landed badly enough that she could not get back onto her feet. She tried pulling herself up using a chair, then the cabinet. Her arms eventually gave out. Her telephone was in another room, so Norah lay on the kitchen floor and waited. 1 hour became 2. Sunlight slowly crossed the tile. The refrigerator hummed. An old clock continued marking minutes somewhere beyond the doorway. No telephone rang. No vehicle entered the driveway. No footsteps crossed the porch. What frightened Norah most was not pain. It was the realization that nobody knew anything was wrong. The strange part was, I wasn't thinking about dying, she said. I was thinking about how normal everything outside probably looked. Grant remained silent. Cars were going by, people were buying groceries, somebody somewhere was probably complaining about the weather, and I was lying 10 yards from that porch wondering how long it would take before anybody noticed I wasn't part of the world anymore. A woman from a nearby farm who occasionally delivered eggs happened to stop later that day and found her. Norah was dehydrated and badly shaken, but otherwise unharmed. The fall ended there. The fear did not. Her nearest relative lived hours away. The neighboring houses were scattered far apart, and Norah refused to ask someone to call every morning merely to confirm that she had made it through another night. Grant understood that stubbornness because he had seen it in her from the road for 2 years. Norah did not fear accepting kindness nearly as much as she feared becoming somebody else's responsibility. "I didn't want to become somebody's assignment," she said. Grant's eyes shifted toward the railing. "So you made the cloth?" Norah nodded. The morning after her fall, she chose a white kitchen cloth because it could easily be seen from the road. If she woke up and everything was all right, she carried it onto the porch and hung it over the railing. In the afternoon, she brought it inside. The next morning, she repeated the ritual. She did it through summer heat, winter frost, rain, grief, sickness, and ordinary days when nothing happened at all. 5 years passed that way. "I never told anybody what it meant." Grant frowned slightly. "Then how was anyone supposed to know?" "They weren't." Norah looked toward the road. "I thought if people saw it long enough, maybe someday they'd notice when they didn't." Grant felt the words settle slowly inside him. Monday morning, the empty railing. Tuesday, empty again. Wednesday, Flint stopping at the driveway. The damp newspapers. The basket of neatly folded white cloths beside the kitchen door. For nearly 2 years, Grant had believed he was watching an elderly woman perform some harmless household ritual. Now he understood that Norah had been sending a message to nobody in particular and everybody who happened to pass. "I'm still here." "You didn't know anybody was paying attention," Grant said. "No." "But you kept doing it." Norah's expression softened. "I had to believe somebody might." Flint lifted his head. Grant rested a hand between the shepherd's ears and looked at Norah. "Turns out somebody was." Norah looked away, wiping quickly beneath one eye before Grant could acknowledge it. He let her have that small piece of dignity. Yet something in him shifted too. For years, Grant had thought noticing people meant accepting responsibilities he wasn't sure he wanted. Norah had taught him something different. Sometimes attention demanded nothing heroic. Sometimes it was simply remembering that another human being should be where they had always been. Several mornings later, Norah was finally strong enough to resume the ritual. At 6:20, the farmhouse door opened. She stepped carefully onto the porch carrying a clean white cloth, shook it once, draped it over the railing and smoothed one corner with her palm. Then she waited. Down the county road came the familiar rhythm of running shoes and 4 steady paws. Grant saw the white cloth from a distance, and something inside him relaxed before he could stop it. He smiled and intended to continue running. Flint stopped. Grant took another step before noticing. "You're getting predictable." The German shepherd remained where he was, staring toward the porch. Grant followed his gaze and saw Norah beside the little table. 2 cups of coffee waited on top. Beneath it sat a bowl of water. Grant laughed softly. "All right." This time, they left the road. Norah said nothing when Grant climbed the porch steps. Grant said nothing when he took the second chair, the same chair he had wondered about so many mornings before. Flint drank from the bowl and settled between them, close enough that Norah could reach down and touch him whenever she wanted. No one needed to explain what had changed. Grant and Flint continued running the same route after that. Most mornings they passed the farmhouse with a wave, but a few mornings each week 6 miles took a little longer. There was coffee on the porch. Sometimes there was conversation. Sometimes there was comfortable silence. Flint usually received something Norah insisted was not breakfast, despite all evidence to the contrary. And every morning, the white cloth still appeared on the railing. To anyone driving past, it remained an ordinary piece of fabric fluttering outside an old farmhouse. Grant knew better. For 5 years, it had meant, "I'm still here. Please notice." Now the final 2 words were no longer necessary. The cloth only needed to say, "I'm still here." Because Norah finally knew that if one morning it wasn't there, someone would notice. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, angels, or signs in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in a familiar face, a faithful dog, an empty porch, or one small detail that someone cared enough to notice. Norah believed for 5 years that if she kept showing the world, "I'm still here," perhaps one day someone would notice when she wasn't. And God placed Grant and Flint on that road, morning after morning, until an ordinary routine became the very thing that helped bring her home. Life is full of people carrying struggles we cannot see. The elderly neighbor who lives alone, the friend who suddenly grows quiet, the stranger whose routine changes. Sometimes noticing is an act of love. Never underestimate what God can do through a small moment of kindness, attention, or compassion. You may be the answer to a prayer you never heard. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this reminder. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, hope, and second chances. May God bless you and your family, protect those you love, strengthen you through difficult days, and remind you that even when you feel unseen, you are never beyond His sight.